Thank you, Nicole. So again, welcome everybody. As I said, my name is Sandra Transchel. I am a professor for supply chain operations management here at KLU. Before I give this short webinar, let me tell you some quick facts about myself. So who am I? I am just a little bit about my background. I've studied business mathematics, so I was trying to combine a little bit some quantitative aspects with business questions. I ended with a diploma. Diploma is a little similar to a bachelor master together. So then already towards the end, I wrote my thesis in the field of production planning, supply chain planning, specifically in the manufacturing business. Then I did a PhD in logistics and supply chain management. So my diploma is from the University of Magdeburg here in Germany. Then I moved to Mannheim. I did my PhD, and afterwards I moved to the US. I was professor at two US business schools. First, I was assistant professor at the Smeal College of Business in Penn State, where I was mainly teaching also bachelors. And then then I moved to New Hampshire, and I was at Tech School of Business at Dartmouth, where I was teaching and doing research also in the field of logistics supply chain management. So I'm at KLU now since 2011. So given the fact that KLU was founded 2010, I am one of the professors who's here the longest. We say one of the oldest professors. I don't like the word oldest, that's why I use the longest here. So what is my research? So my research can be described being in the field of supply chain inventory control. What I like is to analyze how inventory moves through the supply chain, starting from the point of origin and raw material suppliers, or farmers when it comes to agriculture supply chains. Then how is inventory controlled and moved through the supply chain? How much has to be ordered? How much safety stocks need to be kept in different stages in the supply chain, always with the goal of meeting consumer demand and matching supply with demand. I more and more like to look at collaboration aspects, right, between different stages in the supply chain. Retailers, for example, have to negotiate with their suppliers how they get stuff delivered. And normally you have then different firms. Every firm has normally their own objectives and they write contracts. The question is, how can be contracts written that the entire supply chain function most efficiently? And specifically in the past couple of years, I got more and more interested in the field of perishable product supply chain, specifically food supply chains, right? Thinking about food is a product, fresh fruit like fruits, vegetables are highly perishable. You cannot store them for an infinite amount of time. So normally specific lettuce perishes after a couple of days. You want to basically be more efficient in order to reduce food waste. And that is basically one of the aspects I am right now looking at. When it comes to teaching, oh, I have to go back. Back. When it comes to teaching at KLU, I teach in all programs. Currently in the Master of Science program, I teach a course called Demand Planning Inventory Management, where I look at inventory control as well as forecasting issues, and of course capstone project in the bachelor. I was teaching in the past the mathematics course. I have the honor to teach the mathematics in the first semester. So both Christoph and Laura know me from there. So that's normally the course which maybe not everybody likes most, but I think it's good and it's important to learn a few concepts, mathematical concepts, but also to approach more tactical or more complicated problems, because throughout the study you will face many more challenging problems, and sometimes it's not necessarily the mathematical problems that are challenging, but even other problems. It's good to develop a certain structural process for approaching these problems. So that's basically from a teaching point of view. Before I start, let me ask you a short question. So everybody is somewhat faced by the pandemic, right? So all countries had lockdown, and we saw products which were not available. Which products you experience being short, that you could not buy in the supermarket, or you saw on TV that they were not available? Coming up with some ideas. Okay, what do we see? So face masks, right? I think this is the toilet paper. That was, I think, which was in the media for quite some time. What else? What do we have? pasta, flour, right? People apparently like to bake. So in the supermarket where I normally buy, there was a sign right at the entrance: toilet paper, flour, and yeast are out of stock. They even try to announce it at the entrance to avoid that people are coming in and searching for these products. Noodles, pasta sauce, hand sanitizers. Yes, that's what it is. So, well, probably dry products, bread. That's the, apparently people were thinking, well, especially at the beginning of the crisis, nobody really knew what could happen. And maybe there would be a big shortage on products coming in, and people started stockpiling, right? But not when you, so there was in the media a lot of discussion on that people started stockpiling and panic buying. And the reason why there's a shortage that was that people were kind of hoarding products. But I wrote a little article a couple of months ago, or at the beginning and in mid of March, about whether this is really panic buying, right? If you think what happened in the lockdown, right at the beginning in March, within a couple of days, all of a sudden, schools were closing, kindergartens were closed, companies were basically sent their people to home office. So when you think about what is actually consumed, thinking about this toilet paper example, right, is do you think there was really a more increase in consumption in toilet paper? Well, probably not, right? Why should you consume more toilet paper? But when you think what happened is there was a strong shift from people being in the in companies, students being in the universities and schools and kindergartens. The consumption that happened there was all of a sudden moved to the private households. So, and of course, private households buy totally different stuff. So you, of course, don't buy these huge rolls of toilet paper, which you maybe can find in big universities or in companies. But here you normally buy these smaller rolls. So this is this shift in demand all of a sudden, or a shift in consumption, created a shortage for companies who actually produce more for the private households, but on the other hand, lead to an increase in stocks for companies who were producing more for the B2B business. Also baby flowers, all of a sudden, kids were staying at home. Entire families had to say, okay, what do we do with the kids? Well, they started baking. Okay, there was probably also a little bit of stockpiling. Also me, I have to say, I bought a little bit more pasta to make sure that certain dry food I had at home, because nobody really knew what would come. So I think that was probably a mix between panic buying, hoarding, but on the other hand, also a shortage or a shift in consumption and shift in demand from more a B2B business, more to B2C in the private households. So, and I'll come back to this in a second. What does it have to do with supply chain management? Right now, looking more deeper into what did we actually face? And interestingly, even though we have now a pretty international audience, this is probably very similar in countries. So I was trying to find some news articles. Right, this is a New York Times title. That there was a shortage of hand sanitizer. So we saw that one of the answers in the Mentimeter poll was, right, that this, especially at the beginning, hand sanitizers and face masks, because that is also the products which were, from a health perspective, very critical, because you thought, okay, it's wearing these masks, you might feel more protected or even though the media always said, okay, you don't really protect yourself with these simple face masks, but you will definitely protect others. But wearing these face mask, I think, was one of the factors that reduced the bigger spread. Then, well, what I already showed, that these empty shelves for all types of products. That this, we all saw this. So, but especially in Germany, the government always said, look, this is not because of the products are not available somewhere. The problem was that the supply processes are disrupted. So we saw a big disruption in the logistics. Supply chain management. So that's, you already saw that, you see that now supply chain management and a functioning supply chain is very critical even in this crisis. And a product which is maybe more critical, which I didn't see on the poll Mentimeter, various companies have big problems with ventilators, because ventilators in emergency rooms, which is, unfortunately we didn't have this big impact, this problem here in Germany. There were enough emergency beds, but especially in North Italy, they really had an issue that there were so many patients with COVID that they didn't have enough ventilators. And then these are the products which you cannot simply supply in the short period of time. They have to be produced. You have to have the right suppliers in place, the right logistics providers who bring the product. So there are so many steps within the supply chain which have to function in order to guarantee availability. Another example I would like to bring in, which is a totally different field, is the flower industry. You might have heard that, well, we didn't have a shortage of flour, but if you think companies in the flower industry, specifically in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is one of the countries with the biggest industry in the flowers, you could read articles that they had to basically destroy flowers. So I found here, the New York Times writes that 140 million of Dutch tulips had to be crushed. And this was also not just a regional problem. And another article from Reuters said that a Russian florist had to destroy millions of roses. And when you go down in other parts of the world, it's a flower farmer in Gaza, also destroying 3,000 to 5,000 flowers every day. And last example I want to bring in here is a flower trader in Kenya. So you see that this is a problem. The coronavirus and the crisis affected all parts of the world. So what caused these problems that this is a crisis which is not locally. Normally, when you discuss could companies protect themselves from crisis, normally these are regional effects. Thinking about, there was this tsunami a couple of years ago in Japan. Also here, many companies were affected. Also, there was also a critical situation for many residents in that area, but that was a regional problem, right? Of course, it had an effect for many companies in their supply chain, but the source of the crisis was in one region. Now we have the problem that this is a worldwide crisis. So this is a picture I took from the Johns Hopkins University, a screenshot from June 11th. So that was a little bit early this month. So this is already, shows the infection rates all over the world. So this is now relatively late. So basically the China bubbles are already smaller, specifically in February, March. You saw the big bubbles here in Asia. Then shortly later, then the big bubbles came in Europe, and now the spread is basically North America. And I think now in the last couple of weeks, Laura, Brazil and South America, I think the bubbles are much bigger than here. So you see that this is this spread, and this spread basically led to the fact that all global supply chains are somehow affected. I cannot imagine that any company, or that there's any, well, a company of a reasonable size not being affected. So that is basically what you also then see when you look more in logistics and supply chain related articles. So all logistics journals, all logistics experts, all companies who have supply chain experts in there now have to look, okay, what do we have to do? How can we make our supply chain more resilient, more robust against this crisis? One have to say, every practitioner and every expert you talk now say that this is a crisis which they never experienced. So this is far beyond these risk management activities that basically had companies faced before, and the supply chain activities they have in place. So, but you see that one thing is clear, that we refer here to this Harvard Business Review article, that what we need in the long run is definitely supply chains who are resilient, in terms of resilient, that they are coming back quicker than others. So how should you design supply chains that you are more resilient against risk like the coronavirus? Right. So, and what does it have to do? Well, it has to do with supply chain management, right? Here we basically, which areas in the field of supply chain management have to be analyzed and investigated and restructured to make supply chain management or supply chains more resilient. And these are topics which are normally taught in the field of supply chain management. To some extent, there are in the program. For example, we have transport management, transport planning courses. I used here slightly different titles as more something to do that they didn't fit in this nice PowerPoint environment. But there will be a course on inventory control that highly likely also combines some forecasting topics, right? You have to first forecast the demand. How much would you expect in demand before you actually can analyze how much you then need? Inventory looks at how much inventory should you have in your supply chain. Now, for example, thinking about the crisis, more safety stocks would mean you are more flexible with respect to sudden events. You talk about warehouse management. You will talk about purchasing and supply management. How many suppliers should you have for specific parts? Where should the suppliers be located? I'm coming back later on the slide on this, we'll come back to face masks. But if you have only one supplier, which is in China, and you were basically at the beginning at the crisis in big of a trouble because specifically China was locked down, so there were almost no trucks and no logistics going out of China. So therefore, critically analyzing what kind of supplier base should be had, and this is discussed, for example, in supply management courses, and also how should the network be designed in supply chain. So all these are all areas that are discussed in the field of supply chain management and will be somehow be included in some of the courses you will have here at KLU. One course I would like to, one area I would like to particularly go into is called supply chain risk management. Supply chain risk management is one area in the field of supply chain management. You see that supply chain management is pretty broad. And a rough definition is that supply chain risk management is about management of supply chain risks. I have in the next slide the definition what is risk, through coordination and collaboration among supply chain partners to ensure profitability and continuity. Basically, it's a lot of coordinating with different stakeholders in the supply chain to guarantee continuity. And this is, I think, now what we see is specifically critical. But what is risk, right? So there's, when you think of the normal business of a supply chain manager, you always have to deal with uncertainty. There's an uncertainty about demand, right? We're thinking about the retail market there. You don't know how much cereals you will sell tomorrow. This can change from one day to the other. There's always some sort of uncertainty. But what you have to think about from a company perspective is to analyze what is the likelihood that a certain event comes in, and what are the consequences. So this is basically, the risk is defined as some sort of a function. Let me stay a little bit mathematically, but you have to, there is an event, let's say like the Corona crisis, so a pandemic situation. What is the probability of a pandemic, and what are the consequences on the supply chain? And this has to be assessed by practitioners or experts in the company, by some experts, economic experts in the field, and giving what the, depending on what the probability is, it's very unlikely, fairly likely, likely, and so on, and what are the consequences from having maybe natural consequences to severe consequences. You have to come up with initiatives. What should you do as a supply chain manager to back up for this risk? Right? And of course, that depends a little bit on what type of risk we're talking about. One thing is, when it comes to risk, there's this, the World Economic Forum publishes every year a report which is called Supply Risk Report. And in this Supply Risk Report, they are doing surveys worldwide and talk with experts in various fields to come up with these kind of metrics where they plot different risks or different events with respect to likelihood of occurrence and their impact they would have in the supply chain. And I was looking in this report last time and see, okay, where would we find the pandemic? And there's one thing which is said, spread of infectious diseases. I think this is where probably the pandemic would fill in. And that was the report from 2019, basically before the crisis. And you see that, well, this is how they located this, basically the likelihood of occurrence, it's a bit below the average. And when it comes to the, well, impact, oh, it was a little bit above. What, okay. The dot on its own maybe doesn't say so much, but let's say comparing it, for example, with cyber attacks, right? Cyber attacks by the experts assessed being much more likely to happen. So cyber attacks are above the average. And also with a stronger impact. And now you can think about, this is of course discussed, well, after the pandemic, you would probably assess these, the data in a different way. So So therefore, so this is basically one report companies can use to assess a little bit what the likelihoods of occurrence are. But you see that also these reports are very often, they don't know everything, right? So I'm really excited to see how the report looks this year and where they basically put pandemic. Maybe pandemic shows specifically up in this week. So, but when we look at supply chain risk in general, how would you as a company, as a supply chain manager in a company, categorize supply chain risk? Well, normally what you do is you categorize them into supply risk, processing risk, and demand risk, because certain risks would affect maybe your supply process in the company. As thinking about our retail example, certain store shortages we saw. Sometimes you see in the processing part. So, well, an example would here be strikes, right? There's a big strike of of some reunion, and your employees basically go on strike, and you cannot produce the products. It's our internal processing risk. Or you have a demand risk. Here's this example with the flower industry, because why did these companies had to destroy their flowers? Was basically the demand broke from almost one day to the other. No big events, no weddings, no conferences or conventions where they might have need some flowers. So assessing the risk was the important one. And once you have understood what the risks are, the question is then, how vulnerable is your supply chain? As a company expert, supply chain manager, how vulnerable is my supply chain with respect to certain risks that can occur? And vulnerability and understanding vulnerability in the supply chain means, first, you should understand your supply chain, which sounds pretty easy. What does it mean? Well, you should understand when you are in this working for a focal company in your company, where are your suppliers? It's called first-tier suppliers, basically your direct suppliers. But you should also understand where are your second-tier suppliers, because if one of your second-tier suppliers is not able to deliver a critical part to your first-tier supplier, your first-tier supplier cannot deliver the component to you, and then all of a sudden you see this big disruption. You might think, well, companies should understand their internal supply chain, but you cannot imagine how complex supply chains are. In the automotive industry, where they supply all the parts from, they come from all over the world. The stuff is shipped basically from one continent to the next continent before it actually is finally assembled in the final product. So so this is supply chain visibility, understanding where your suppliers are, where your customers are. That is basically the first critical thing to be, well, more resilient towards supply chain risk. And this is also one which is discussed. Now, what can be done to mitigate effects? Supply chain risk management is nothing new, right? This is not that we basically now see, oh, Corona came in and we have to come up with new solutions. So actually, there are many strategies out there who basically should help to find mitigation strategies for this kind of risk, right? First, well, in the first glance, you should try to avoid having a risk. Well, this is not, especially Corona, we see not always possible. Secondly, what can be done to control the risk in a better way? There are certain initiatives. I don't want to detailedly explain everything, but for example, one called vertical integration. Maybe now companies look more, okay, before we outsource certain production, maybe now we look back, how can we vertically integrate back supply processes into our own company? I think there will be a big shift now, more rethinking about how vertical integration, how processes which were outsourced in the past are now back insourced into your own company in order to guarantee a better flow. Or collaboration, cooperation, joint collaboration with your suppliers that normally also creates better visibility, a better understanding. You know better where your parts that you will source are currently located. You have a better risk assessment of all things that could happen. And many companies will probably also rethink more flexibility strategies to have multiple suppliers in place, right? If you have only one supplier for a specific component, and this supplier is for whatever reason not able to deliver, you might run into problems. So multi-sourcing strategies will probably be more more often in the future than it has been in the past, because in the past, when it was more cost oriented, if you have only one supplier, you can negotiate better deals, you can lower the cost, but on the other hand, it makes your supply chain much more vulnerable. These are strategies, and it's a paper from 2003, which is, you see that this is not a very new one, but these strategies, maybe some new ones because Corona created a few more issues, but these strategies probably will be more on the table now in the future for many companies. Another article I want to mention, there's a professor from Stanford University, or Stanford University, some of you might know, is basically one of the best universities in the world. This is a professor, is a very well-known supply chain professor. He already wrote in 2004, it's a paper from 2004, that only companies that are built, are able to build agile, adaptive, and aligned supply chains are the one who will stay competitive and survive in the long run. What does it mean? Agile means you need to be agile and respond quickly to sudden effects, like, for example, this Corona crisis pandemic, which came in within a couple of days, let's say, or the strong effects came into place within a couple of days or weeks. So you have to respond very quickly. You have to be adaptive to more seasonal changes, and aligned means that especially supply chain partners within the supply chain should be better coordinated, their decisions should be better aligned. Because in the past, supply chains who were mainly focusing on cost and speed and availability will maybe have more problems to survive in the long run. Right? This is, as I said, this is a 2004 paper. Most of the, let's say, theoretical concepts, I'm talking from a theoretical point of view, are not new, but companies probably will pick up now again more and more these concepts and see what has to be changed to be more agile, adaptive, or aligned. That sounds theoretical, it sounds very, well, let's say, dry. But what does it mean? What kind of structures have to be changed to guarantee or to improve these characteristics? Oh, we have still one question. There we go. One other poll, another question. So the face mask. We had this big face mask problem, right? How many of you did try to make your own face mask? I have to say I did not. I asked my mom. Right, so she's retired and she has enough time and also the capabilities. I don't. So who was trying to build their own face mask? I know I had a friend of mine. He was trying to do it with a stapler and some one-time usage towel. Right, there's this one. Disposable towel, and not yet. I'm trusting the pros. Yes, and it was a failure. Only it was only 30%. It was a success. Well, you saw that the industry picked up this problem pretty quickly. So we had this face mask problem, and that is not only right. It's not that we cannot bake, right? That was really also had health implications. One reason it was that first there was all of a sudden a tremendous increase in demand, and not only regionally but worldwide. So governments were requiring to wear face masks, and this is a demand problem or the demand side. And on the other hand, face masks, specifically, let's say these low-level medical face masks, were mainly produced in China. And specifically at the beginning, so China was mostly affected. On the one hand, they could not cope with the enormous spike in demand, and on the other hand, they had on their own a lockdown, and also could not produce. The logistics was broken, and many countries simply didn't have supply alternatives. So everybody was looking for face masks. So people were trying. So consumers were buying then these medical face masks, and then made the problem even more severe for health workers, because then doctors, physicians, they were desperately looking for face masks and couldn't find any. Then it started that people were basically sewing their own face masks. But this, of course, works for people like you and me, but not for medical workers, right? So that's why. But it was good, at least it basically saved and did more medical face mask for the medical people. But what we also observed was that more and more companies who were actually in a totally different field started producing face masks, and not only short term. Now, what we see that here there's a company called Sportlastics, which is in the south of Germany. So this is actually a company from a textile industry. Now they're changing their product portfolio from textile products, but they have the experience dealing with textiles, and also with dealing with textiles that have these specific conditions for face masks, and they were collaborating with several institutions, medical institutions in Germany to improve their face masks, to build the same standards as really highly well, quality-wise, highly high standard face masks, like these FFP2 face masks that is really really required in surgery rooms and for physicians. So what we will probably see is that these companies who are producing these face masks in the future will probably increase. So meaning what we see that we go back from just sourcing everything from China. So countries have to make sure that they are flexible enough to shifting production relatively quickly back from one source to the other, even though probably sourcing from China is probably cheaper. But if you rely only on sourcing everything from one supplier, you have really a situation that you don't want to get in case there is a crisis like a pandemic coming in. So which means in the future we will probably see that more production, or companies are more flexible in producing, shifting production from one product to the other. And governance will also make sure that in specific regions within Europe, there are production plants who are able to be flexible enough to switch back and produce critical components like face masks, or maybe even and other products that we don't know yet, right? So, which means Corona crisis obviously will definitely change. It will affect all areas in the field of supply chain management. I'm pretty sure for supply chain managers, there will be a huge job market in the future. And this Corona situation that we are in right now, and we also don't get out of this that quickly, will dramatically, will lead to a mind shift for many companies. They will bring in more experts. So all areas that I mentioned, which will be taught in the field of supply chain management, will have to be redesigned or critically rethought. So also the supply chain strategies and supply chain risk management in general. And this, but first, of course, before we can think what can be done after COVID, first, companies are currently doing a more firefighting strategy to recover, because the first now critical is to recover from the situation. And in the second step, to stay resilient. So how? Well, in class, what we do, we teach in the field of supply chain management various strategies. So there are definitely more new strategies that can be discussed and presented in classes, in various classes: transport, inventory control, supply chain strategy. We will invite various guest speakers from companies. I think they have a lot to talk, what they did in their situation. You can also do specific projects, specifically these bigger project at the end in the last semester. So we definitely give the opportunity to focus also on COVID related topics in here, also maybe in an internship, so in other capstone related projects within classes. But on the other hand, it's also the Corona crisis has such a big effect, and is such a new dimension when it comes to risk management. There are also new research areas be created and pop up. So there's also a lot of research, potential research which can be done in the future. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.